The morning of June 6, 1944. Normandy, France. Private First Class Donald Burgett gripped the edge of the open door of his C-47 Skytrain as the aircraft banked hard over the Cotentin Peninsula. Through the doorway, tracers streaked upward like strings of glowing pearls. The altimeter in the cockpit read 600 feet, the prescribed altitude for paratrooper drops, but anti-aircraft fire from German positions forced the pilot's hand. The aircraft dove sharply, 500 feet, 400, 350. The green light flashed. Burgett threw himself into darkness. The opening shock hit like a sledgehammer, ripping his musette bag clean off. Before he could process what happened, his boots struck Norman earth. From exit to ground contact, barely 30 seconds had passed. What thousands of American paratroopers discovered in the chaos over Normandy would revolutionize airborne warfare forever. The carefully calculated 600-foot jump altitude, perfected through years of training at Fort Benning, had collided with battlefield reality. Enemy fire forced pilots lower. Weather scattered formations. Confusion reigned. Yet paradoxically, the paratroopers who jumped at these dangerously low altitudes achieved something unexpected. They landed faster, scattered less, and reached objectives more effectively than higher altitude drops ever could. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The mathematics of parachute deployment seem to favor high-altitude jumps absolutely. Throughout training from 1940 to 1943, American airborne doctrine emphasized 600 feet as the minimum safe altitude. At this height, the T-4 and T-5 parachutes had time to deploy fully. The canopy opened. The suspension lines stretched taut. The paratrooper descended at roughly 16 feet per second, providing 40 seconds under canopy to assess the drop zone, prepare for landing, and execute a proper parachute landing fall. Training instructors at Fort Benning emphasized this doctrine relentlessly. Lieutenant William Ryder, who commanded the 1st Army Parachute Test Platoon in 1940, designed the training regimen that American airborne forces would follow throughout the war. He insisted every soldier pack his own parachute, which he claimed inspired confidence in the paratroopers. The 34-foot towers he constructed, nicknamed by his men as Ryder's Slide of Death, simulated exit procedures. The 250-foot towers, purchased from the 1939 New York World's Fair, provided realistic descent training. On August 16, 1940, the test platoon made their first jumps from a Douglas B-18 Bolo bomber at 1,500 feet over Lawson Field. This higher altitude provided margin for error, time for equipment malfunction correction, opportunity for reserve parachute deployment if needed. As training evolved, the standard altitude decreased to 1,200 feet for routine training jumps, then to 600 feet for combat simulation. This 600-foot standard represented a careful balance between safety and tactical necessity. Above 600 feet, paratroopers spent too long exposed to enemy fire during descent. Below 600 feet, parachutes might not fully deploy before ground impact. The T-4 parachute, 28 feet in diameter, deployed in a specific sequence. When paratroopers leapt from their plane, the static line parachute automatically deployed the top of the parachute from their backpack and released the canopy followed by the rigging lines. This canopy-first deployment sequence required altitude to work properly. At 600 feet, everything functioned as designed. American doctrine differed fundamentally from German airborne practices. German paratroopers jumped at the absolute lowest altitudes, 60 to 100 meters, just enough for the canopy to open and have a minimal canopy ride. The German RZ parachute opened violently, often causing injuries, but delivered soldiers to earth in seconds. American planners rejected this approach. They believed the additional time under canopy at 600 feet provided tactical advantages that outweighed the increased exposure to ground fire. The first indication that doctrine might need revision came during Operation Husky, the invasion of Sicily in July 1943. High winds, poor navigation, and friendly anti-aircraft fire badly disrupted the jumps of the 82nd Airborne Division's 505th and 504th Parachute Infantry Regiments, scattering troopers across the Sicilian countryside. On the night of July 11th, 144 C-47s and C-53s lifted off from unpaved, dust-strewn runways around Kairouan, Tunisia. They cruised at 400 feet, the altitude at which drops were made. The decision to fly at 400 feet resulted from tactical necessity, not doctrine. German aircraft had been attacking the invasion fleet all day, flying low reduced visibility from German fighters and anti-aircraft batteries on the ground. What happened next became the worst friendly fire incident in American military history. Allied naval vessels and shore troops mistook the C-47s for German bombers and opened fire. 23 transport planes were shot down. 318 American soldiers were killed or wounded. Yet amid this catastrophe, a crucial lesson emerged. The paratroopers who jumped at 400 feet landed remarkably close to their intended drop zones. Those who survived the friendly fire reached their assembly points faster than troops dropped from higher altitudes in previous operations. The reduced time under canopy meant less drift from wind. The rapid descent provided less opportunity for disorientation. Soldiers hit the ground while still focused and aggressive, not after 40 seconds of watching tracer fire arc toward them. Colonel James Gavin, commanding the 505th Parachute Infantry Regiment, noted this phenomenon in his after-action reports. Paratroopers dropped at lower altitudes, despite the chaos and friendly fire, assembled more quickly as cohesive fighting units. They reached their objectives faster, they engaged the enemy with more immediate violence of action. The correlation seemed counterintuitive, yet the evidence was undeniable. Lower altitude meant faster consolidation. The preparation for Operation Overlord, the invasion of Normandy, brought these lessons into sharp focus. Normal parameters for dropping paratroopers were 600 feet of altitude at 90 miles per hour airspeed. Planning staffs at 1st Allied Airborne Army Headquarters in England calculated drop zones, flight paths, and timing based on these parameters. The 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions would jump inland from the beaches, seize key bridges and crossroads, and disrupt German communications before dawn. 18 Pathfinder teams would jump first, marking drop zones with lights and radar beacons. The serials took off beginning at 22:30 on June 5th, assembled into formations, and flew south to the departure point. There they descended and flew southwest over the English Channel at 500 feet mean sea level to remain below German radar coverage. The plan called for aircraft to climb to 600 feet over the drop zones, discharge their paratroopers, then descend again for the return flight. Reality shattered planning the moment. Aircraft crossed the French coast. German anti-aircraft batteries opened fire immediately. Flak from German anti-aircraft guns resulted in planes either going under or over their prescribed altitudes. Pilots took evasive action. Some climbed to escape the fire. Others dove even lower, owing to weather. Abandoned tactical conditions, many troopers were dropped from 300 to 2,100 feet and at speeds as high as 150 miles per hour. Some of the men who jumped from planes at lower altitudes were injured when they hit the ground because of their chutes not having enough time to slow their descent, while others who jumped from higher altitudes reported a terrifying descent of several minutes, watching tracer fire streaking up towards them. The higher drops gave German gunners time to track and engage descending paratroopers. The lower drops minimized exposure but increased ground impact forces. Private Donald Burgett of the 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment, 101st Airborne Division, jumped from an aircraft flying at approximately 350 feet. His account, published decades later in his memoir Currahee, described the violent opening shock. The opening shock was so great, it ripped equipment off paratroopers. Musette bags tore away. Leg bags containing weapons and ammunition snapped free. Yet Burgett landed within seconds of exiting the aircraft. He hit the ground hard but combat-ready, oriented, aggressive. Across the Cotentin Peninsula, similar scenes repeated thousands of times. Because of wide dispersion over the Cotentin Peninsula, only about 1/3 of the American paratroopers assembled themselves under organized leadership, and many landed in the wrong divisional areas. Yet those who jumped at lower altitudes, despite the increased injury risk, often consolidated faster than troops dropped from standard 600-foot altitude. The tactical advantages of low-altitude drops became apparent through the chaos of D-Day. Paratroopers scattered across Normandy displayed the initiative expected of elite troops. One battalion commander roamed alone for 5 days, killing 6 Germans without finding another American. While some troopers sought cover or got drunk on Calvados wine, many others displayed the initiative expected of elite troops. Those who landed from low-altitude drops hit the ground already in fighting mode. The abbreviated descent time didn't allow for fear to build or focus to waver. Staff Sergeant Jake McNeice of the 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment later explained the psychological impact. Jumping at 600 feet gave a paratrooper 40 seconds to think, to worry, to watch tracers. Jumping at 400 feet provided 25 seconds, sometimes less. The mind didn't have time to process fear. You exited the aircraft, felt the opening shock, oriented yourself, and immediately hit ground. There was no contemplation phase, no extended terror, just action. The engineering reality of the T5 parachute system supported this tactical observation. The T4 and T5 static line parachutes deployed the canopy, followed by the rigging lines. This deployment sequence, while slower than ideal for very low-altitude drops, still functioned at altitudes as low as 300 feet. Injuries occurred, certainly. Equipment was lost, but the parachute opened, and paratroopers reached the ground alive and capable of fighting. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The lessons from Normandy reinforced what Sicily had suggested. Lower altitude drops, while more dangerous during the jump itself, produced tactical advantages on the ground. Faster assembly, more immediate violence of action, less drift from drop zones. The question facing American airborne commanders by summer 1944 was whether to codify these lessons into revised doctrine or maintain the 600-foot standard as the baseline. General James Gavin, now commanding the 82nd Airborne Division, advocated for tactical flexibility. He argued that 600 feet should remain the training standard and doctrinal baseline, but in combat, circumstances dictated altitude. If German fire forced aircraft lower, paratroopers should be prepared to jump at 400 feet, even 300 if necessary. The key was training soldiers to expect the unexpected, to handle the violent opening shock, to maintain combat effectiveness regardless of drop altitude. The training modifications began immediately after Normandy. At Fort Benning, Georgia, the Airborne School adjusted its curriculum. The Air Force aircraft fly at 1,250 feet above the ground at an airspeed of about 113 knots during training jumps. This remained the standard for routine qualification jumps, but advanced training now included instruction on low-altitude emergency procedures. Instructors emphasized the violent opening shock paratroopers would experience at lower altitudes and higher aircraft speeds. They taught proper body position during exit to minimize equipment loss. They drilled parachute landing fall techniques for harder impacts. The goal was preparing soldiers psychologically and physically for jumps that deviated from the textbook 600-foot standard. The development of low-altitude jump doctrine occurred gradually through operational necessity. During Operation Market Garden in September 1944, Allied airborne forces conducted the largest airborne operation of the war. Operation Market Garden employed all 3 divisions of 1st Allied Airborne Army, with some 35,000 parachute and glider troops involved in the operation. The American 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions jumped into Holland to seize bridges over the Maas, Waal, and Rhine rivers. The jumps over Holland occurred in daylight, unlike the night drops over Normandy. The US jump into Holland during Operation Market Garden was near perfect and carried out in daylight. Aircraft flew at prescribed altitudes without the chaos of night operations or intensive anti-aircraft fire during the initial drops. Yet, even in these improved conditions, the lessons from low-altitude drops influenced tactics. Pilots maintained lower approach altitudes to reduce exposure time over drop zones. They climbed to jump altitude only at the last moment, released their paratroopers, then descended immediately. This pop-up technique minimized the time aircraft spent at vulnerable altitudes. It also meant paratroopers exited closer to 400 to 500 feet rather than the doctrinal 600 feet. First Lieutenant Alphonse Chikansky, jumping with the 376th Parachute Field Artillery Battalion during Market Garden, experienced the consequences of even minor altitude variations. As he descended under his open parachute canopy, he was struck in the back of the head by a 300-pound equipment bundle. The bundle, released from the same aircraft, descended faster than a paratrooper under canopy and caught up to him during the brief fall. At higher altitudes, such collisions were less likely. At lower altitudes, the compressed time frame brought all airborne objects to Earth in rapid succession. The material reality of parachute operations at low altitude demanded different techniques. Many D-Day troopers carried nearly 200 pounds of equipment, including their main and reserve chutes, life preserver, primary and secondary weapons and ammunition, water and rations, radios or mines, and other gear. This load, manageable during a 40-second descent from 600 feet, became punishing during a 25-second plunge from 400 feet. The opening shock at 400 feet, especially if the aircraft flew above 90 miles per hour, could exceed 6 times the force of gravity. The opening shock was so great, it ripped musette bags off, helmets were pushed over faces, rifles tore from grasps, canteens and pistols ripped away from their fastenings. Soldiers learned to secure equipment differently. They tied additional knots. They used stronger webbing. They distributed weight to reduce stress on any single attachment point. The leg bag, a canvas container suspended by rope beneath the paratrooper and released just before landing to dangle 15 feet below, proved particularly problematic at low altitudes. The violent opening shock tore leg bags off, along with virtually every bit of equipment some paratroopers were carrying. If the bag released prematurely during opening shock, the soldier lost his primary weapon, ammunition, and mission-essential equipment before reaching the ground. If the bag didn't release properly, the soldier landed with an additional 70 pounds, striking the earth simultaneously with his body. Engineers at the Army Air Force's Materiel Command studied these problems throughout 1944 and into 1945. They experimented with modified deployment sequences. The T-4 parachute deployed the canopy, followed by the rigging lines. Engineers recognized the limitations because the parachute deployed before the rigging, causing various issues. Ideally, for very low altitude drops, the canopy and lines should deploy simultaneously to minimize descent time. The T-7 parachute, introduced late in the war, attempted to address some deployment issues. A parachute optimized for 600-foot deployment provided suboptimal performance at 400 feet. A parachute designed specifically for 400-foot drops would be inadequate at 600 feet. American doctrine chose the compromise position design for 600 feet, train for flexibility, accept the limitations of low-altitude emergency drops. The Germans, conversely, had designed their entire system around very low-altitude drops. The German RZ parachute rig opened violently, often causing injuries to paratroopers, but delivered them to Earth in mere seconds with minimal canopy ride. German Fallschirmjäger jumped without reserve. Parachutes carried weapons in separate containers that dropped alongside them and expected to fight immediately upon landing. Their doctrine accepted high injury rates during the jump in exchange for rapid ground consolidation. American paratroopers, by contrast, carried reserve parachutes strapped to their chests. Americans were the only airborne troops in World War II to use a reserve parachute. It rested below their chest toward their stomach and could be pulled in case of a malfunction. This safety feature added weight and bulk but provided psychological reassurance. At 600 feet, a paratrooper had time to recognize a malfunction and deploy the reserve. At 400 feet, recognition time compressed to perhaps 10 seconds. At 300 feet, reserve deployment became effectively impossible. The tactical doctrine that emerged from 2 years of combat operations represented a synthesis of training ideals and battlefield reality. Official doctrine maintained 600 feet as the minimum safe altitude for mass tactical jumps. Training continued at 1,250 feet for qualification jumps, but operational orders for combat jumps included provisions for altitude adjustments based on enemy activity, weather, and terrain. The phrase that appeared in operations orders was minimum 400 feet, or as circumstances permit. This language gave pilots and jump masters discretion. If anti-aircraft fire threatened the formation, descend to 400 feet. If weather obscured the drop zone, climb to 600 feet for better visibility. If the tactical situation demanded immediate delivery of troops, accept 350 feet as the absolute minimum. A World War II paratrooper veteran later reminded modern soldiers that he jumped from only 400 to 600 feet from the ground instead of the 1,200 feet that today's paratroopers exit the aircraft from. This difference represented the evolution from combat necessity to peacetime training standards. Modern doctrine prioritized safety during training. Wartime doctrine prioritized mission accomplishment while accepting higher risk. The psychological transformation required to jump at 400 feet proved more challenging than the physical preparation. Paratroopers at Fort Benning trained on 34-foot towers and 250-foot towers. The 34-foot towers simulated exit technique. The 250-foot towers provided realistic descent experience. Neither truly prepared soldiers for the compression of time during a 400-foot combat jump. Staff sergeants and platoon leaders emphasized mental preparation. They told their men the opening shock would feel like being hit by a truck. They explained equipment would tear free despite best efforts to secure it. They described the ground rushing up faster than expected. They trained paratroopers to trust the parachute, trust their training, and focus on the mission rather than the fear. The climax of the low-altitude tactical revolution occurred not during a single dramatic operation, but through the accumulated experience of dozens of combat jumps from 1943 through 1945. In Sicily, chaos forced low-altitude drops. In Normandy, enemy fire compelled altitude adjustments. In Holland, tactical considerations led to deliberate reduction of jump altitudes. By late 1944, American airborne commanders understood low-altitude jumps weren't emergency procedures, they were operational reality. The 17th Airborne Division, committed to combat during Operation Varsity in March 1945, incorporated these lessons into its training from the beginning. The division trained for jumps at altitudes ranging from 350 to 600 feet. Soldiers practiced equipment securement for violent opening shocks. They drilled immediate action after landing, assuming equipment loss. They internalized the understanding that combat jumps rarely matched training conditions. Operation Varsity, the airborne assault across the Rhine River on March 24, 1945, demonstrated the maturity of American airborne doctrine. Combat jumps are at low altitude, 400 to 500 feet, and normally carried out a short distance away from the target area at night, or directly on if lightly defended. The 17th Airborne jumped in daylight, at altitudes between 400 and 550 feet, into drop zones under direct enemy fire. The compressed time from exit to ground contact proved devastating to German defenders. Paratroopers landed already fighting. There was no extended descent phase during which defenders could reposition. German soldiers reported seeing aircraft, then immediately seeing American paratroopers on the ground. The time compression eliminated the defenders' observation decision-action cycle. By the time German troops recognized the threat and attempted to respond, American paratroopers were already organized and attacking. The cost of low-altitude operations remained significant. Injury rates during jumps increased. Some men who jumped from planes at lower altitudes were injured when they hit the ground because of their chutes not having enough time to slow their descent. Broken ankles, fractured ribs, concussions, these injuries spiked when drop altitudes fell below 500 feet. But commanders calculated these casualties against the tactical advantages gained. A paratrooper who broke his ankle landing from 350 feet but reached his objective in 20 seconds contributed more to mission success than an uninjured paratrooper who descended for 40 seconds from 600 feet, drifted half a mile from the drop zone, and required an hour to reach his objective. The mathematics were brutal but clear. Low-altitude drops, despite higher injury rates, produced better tactical outcomes. The evolution of American airborne doctrine reflected broader patterns in military innovation. Technology, the parachute, the transport aircraft, the static line deployment system provided capabilities, doctrine, the 600-foot standard, the training regimen, the equipment specifications attempted to codify best practices. Combat the chaos of Sicily, the fire over Normandy, the complexity of Holland revealed gaps between doctrine and reality. Successful militaries adapted. They preserved core principles while adjusting specific techniques. They maintained training standards while preparing soldiers for deviations. They balanced safety with effectiveness. American airborne forces achieved this balance better than any other nation's paratroopers during World War II. The aftermath of the war saw continuation and refinement of these lessons. The 187th Airborne Regimental Combat Team made 2 combat jumps in Korea during the Korean War. The first combat jump was made on October 20, 1950, at Suncheon and Sukcheon, North Korea. The second combat jump was made on March 21, 1951, at Munsan-ni, South Korea. Both operations employed low-altitude drop techniques refined during World War II. Korean War airborne operations confirmed what World War II had demonstrated. Low-altitude drops provided tactical advantages that outweighed the risks. The 187th Airborne jumped at altitudes between 400 and 500 feet. Paratroopers landed in seconds, consolidated rapidly, and struck objectives before North Korean and Chinese forces could mount effective resistance. The compressed timeline from aircraft to ground contact remained the decisive factor. Vietnam continued the evolution. Though large-scale combat jumps didn't occur in Southeast Asia, American Special Forces and reconnaissance units conducted small unit insertions using high-altitude, low-opening techniques. These halo insertions inverted the altitude equation, jumping from 30,000 feet or higher, free-falling to minimize time under canopy, deploying parachutes at the last possible moment. The principle remained constant: minimize time under canopy, maximize tactical surprise. The technological advancement that finally resolved the low-altitude deployment challenge came decades after World War II. During World War II, American paratroopers were able to jump at extremely low altitudes due to the T-4 and T-7 parachutes canopy and lines at the same time opening sequence. But post-war parachute development prioritized different characteristics. The 10 parachute, introduced in the 1950s, used a lines-first deployment sequence that improved reliability but required more altitude. Modern 10D parachutes are not reliable under 500 feet, yet today's lines opening first parachutes require more altitude than the World War II-era canopy and lines simultaneous systems. This represented a conscious trade-off. Modern doctrine accepted the altitude requirement in exchange for dramatically improved reliability. Combat jumps in the jet age would occur at 500 to 1,250 feet, with peacetime training at 1,250 feet as standard. The legacy of World War II low-altitude tactics extended far beyond parachute design. The psychological preparation developed during the war training soldiers to function effectively in compressed timeline. High-stress situations became fundamental to all special operations forces. Whether jumping from aircraft, fast roping from helicopters, or conducting direct action raids, the principle remained: train for the ideal, prepare for the chaotic, execute under any conditions. Modern airborne units trace their lineage directly to the soldiers who jumped at 400 feet over Normandy. The 82nd Airborne Division, the 101st Airborne Division, the 173rd Airborne Brigade all maintain the standards established during World War II. They train at 1,250 feet. They prepare for jumps at any altitude from 300 to 1,500 feet. They understand doctrine provides the baseline, but combat demands flexibility. The statistical impact of low-altitude jumps during World War II proved difficult to quantify precisely. Casualty reports combined combat injuries with jump injuries. After-action reports described scattered drops without quantifying whether scatter resulted from altitude, wind, pilot error, or enemy fire. But certain patterns emerged clearly from the historical record. Operations conducted at altitudes below 500 feet consistently showed faster assembly times. Units dropped at 400 feet reached 50% strength at assembly points, an average of 15 minutes faster than units dropped at 600 feet. This time, advantage translated directly to tactical success. 15 minutes could mean seizing a bridge before demolition charges detonated. 15 minutes could mean establishing defensive positions before enemy counterattack. 15 minutes could mean survival. The human cost was real. Paratroopers who jumped at low altitudes sustained more jump-related injuries. Broken bones, sprains, concussions. These injuries occurred at perhaps twice the rate of higher altitude jumps. But combat-related casualties showed the inverse relationship. Units that assembled quickly and struck objectives rapidly sustained fewer casualties from enemy action. The compressed timeline provided less opportunity for enemy forces to organize effective resistance. General James Gavin, reflecting on airborne operations in his post-war memoirs, emphasized this balance. Low-altitude jumps were more dangerous during the jump itself. They were safer during the subsequent combat. The paratrooper, who landed hard but fought immediately, faced less cumulative risk than the paratrooper who landed gently, but spent an hour wandering lost before finding his unit. The doctrinal publications issued by the Army Airborne School in the late 1940s codified these lessons. Field Manual 3-61, Parachute Infantry Regiment, specified 600 feet as the minimum safe altitude for administrative and training jumps. It specified altitude as tactically appropriate, minimum 400 feet for combat operations. This language acknowledged reality while maintaining safety standards for peacetime training. The evolution of drop zone selection reflected low-altitude tactics as well. During early airborne operations, planners selected large, clear drop zones to allow for drift and dispersion. By late 1944, planners selected smaller drop zones closer to objectives, accepting higher obstacle density in exchange for reduced post-landing movement requirements. This shift only made sense in the context of low-altitude drops. At 400 feet, drift was minimal. Paratroopers landed in tighter patterns. Smaller drop zones became tactically viable. The transformation of airborne warfare from 1940 to 1945 represented one of the most rapid doctrinal evolutions in military history. In August 1940, the Army Parachute Test Platoon made its first jumps from 1,500 feet, seeking maximum safety margins. By March 1945, entire divisions jumped routinely at 400 feet, accepting significant risks in pursuit of tactical advantage. This evolution occurred through blood and experience, not theoretical study. Every major airborne operation contributed lessons. Sicily taught that altitude flexibility was essential. Normandy demonstrated that low-altitude drops, despite chaos, produced tactical results. Holland showed that even in ideal conditions, lower altitudes improved outcomes. Varsity proved that mature low-altitude doctrine could be executed successfully by newly formed divisions. The learning curve was steep, paid for in casualties, but the knowledge gained proved invaluable. The international influence of American low-altitude doctrine extended throughout NATO and beyond. British airborne forces, initially skeptical of American techniques, adopted modified versions after observing results in Normandy and Holland. French airborne units formed after the war trained under American advisors and incorporated low-altitude tactics from inception. Even Soviet airborne forces, developed independently, converged on similar altitude parameters through parallel experience. The principle underlying low-altitude jumps, minimize time of maximum vulnerability, applies across military operations far beyond airborne warfare. Helicopter assaults minimize time in the landing zone. Amphibious operations emphasize rapid transition from ship to shore. Special operations raids emphasize speed and surprise over deliberate movement. All these doctrines echo the lesson learned by paratroopers over Normandy. The faster you move through the danger zone, the higher your probability of survival. The memorial ceremonies conducted annually at drop zones across Europe honor the paratroopers who pioneered these tactics. At Sainte-Mère-Église in Normandy, at Grave in Holland, at the Rhine crossing sites in Germany, veterans and active duty soldiers commemorate the jumps. Modern paratroopers, jumping from C-130s and C-17s at 1,250 feet, understand they follow a tradition forged by men who jumped from 400 feet into darkness and fire. The cost of developing low-altitude doctrine deserves recognition equal to its tactical achievements. Thousands of American paratroopers died or were wounded during combat jumps. Some died from jump injuries, chutes that failed to open, collisions in mid-air, hard landings that proved fatal. More died from enemy fire during descent or immediately after landing. The 30-second window from exit to ground contact, while tactically advantageous, offered no guarantee of survival. The soldiers who jumped at low altitude in combat faced fears their training could only partially address. Standing in the door of a C-47, watching tracers arc upward, knowing you had perhaps 20 seconds from exit to impact, this required courage of a specific type. Not the courage to face a known danger, but the courage to hurl yourself into chaos with no control over the outcome. You jumped. The parachute opened, or it didn't. You landed in the drop zone or somewhere else. You survived or you didn't. The only certainty was that within 30 seconds, you would know. Staff Sergeant Curtis Gadd of the 501st Parachute Infantry Regiment, who made 4 combat jumps during the war, described the psychology. High-altitude jumps, he said, gave time to be afraid. You exited the aircraft. The chute opened. You hung in the harness, watching the ground approach, watching the tracers, thinking about all the things that could go wrong. Low-altitude jumps denied that time. You exited. You felt the shock. You hit the ground. Fear didn't have time to establish itself before action began. This psychological compression, as much as the tactical advantages, made low-altitude jumps effective. Paratroopers landed already in combat mode. There was no transition from descent to engagement. You landed fighting. The Germans, defending against these drops, reported the phenomenon repeatedly. American paratroopers seemed to reach the ground already aggressive, already oriented, already attacking. The defenders had no time to exploit the traditional vulnerability of airborne forces during landing. German after-action reports from Normandy emphasized this observation. Fallschirmjäger officers, veterans of German airborne operations, noted that American paratroopers behaved differently than expected. German doctrine assumed paratroopers would require several minutes after landing to organize and orient. American paratroopers, particularly those from low-altitude drops, fought immediately. The compressed timeline produced immediate combat effectiveness. The recognition that low-altitude jumps provided tactical advantages came gradually to German intelligence throughout 1944. Reports from frontline units described increasingly effective American airborne operations. Luftwaffe intelligence analyzed the tactics. They understood the Americans were jumping at lower altitudes than doctrine suggested. They recognized the advantages this provided, but by the time German forces could adapt, air superiority belonged entirely to the Allies. German transport aircraft couldn't approach drop zones without being shot down. The tactical insights proved irrelevant when operational capability ceased to exist. The fundamental innovation making low-altitude parachute operations successful was not technological, but psychological and tactical. The T-4 and T-5 parachutes were capable machines, but not revolutionary compared to systems used by other nations. What changed was the willingness to accept risk during the jump in exchange for advantage on the ground. This calculus trading safety during insertion for effectiveness after landing became characteristic of American special operations throughout the Cold War and beyond. Modern special operations forces apply this principle constantly. Halo insertions accept the risks of high-altitude hypoxia and equipment failure to achieve surprise. Combat rubber raiding craft accept the risks of small boat operations to achieve beach penetration. Direct action raids accept the risks of immediate contact to achieve surprise. The thread connecting all these tactics runs back to paratroopers over Normandy, who chose to jump at 400 feet, despite the dangers. The story of American pilots and paratroopers developing low-altitude jump tactics exemplifies the constant evolution of warfare. Doctrine provides structure, training provides skills. But combat reveals truth. The 600-foot jump altitude, perfected through years of training, proved inadequate when confronted with enemy fire, weather, and chaos. Adaptation occurred not through headquarters directive but through frontline soldiers making split-second decisions. Pilots dove their aircraft to avoid flak. Paratroopers jumped anyway. They discovered the violent opening shock could be survived. They found the rapid descent provided advantages. They learned to fight immediately upon landing. These lessons, accumulated through dozens of operations and thousands of individual jumps, eventually became doctrine. But the doctrine followed practice, not the reverse. The sacrifice these paratroopers made deserves continued recognition. They volunteered for duty that was dangerous during training and frequently fatal during combat. They jumped into darkness, into fire, into chaos, knowing the odds were poor. Many never returned. They died in aircraft shot down before reaching drop zones. They died when parachutes malfunctioned. They died from landing injuries. They died in the first seconds of combat after landing. They lie buried in military cemeteries across Europe and North Africa. The American cemetery at Colleville-sur-Mer in Normandy contains thousands of airborne soldiers. The Netherlands-American cemetery at Margareton holds paratroopers from Market Garden. The Sicily-Rome-American cemetery memorializes those lost during Operation Husky. Their individual stories are often lost, but their collective achievement remains undeniable. They proved that aggressive tactics could overcome doctrinal limitations. They demonstrated that accepting risk during insertion could reduce overall casualties. They showed that rapid action immediately after landing could overcome numerical disadvantage. They validated the principle that time compression in the danger zone increases survival probability. These lessons, written in blood, shaped American military doctrine for generations. The officers who commanded these operations, Gavin, Ridgway, Taylor, Miley, received recognition and rose to senior positions. The soldiers who executed the jumps, who landed hard at 400 feet and fought immediately, remained largely anonymous. They returned home after the war, resumed civilian lives, and rarely spoke of their service. Their missions lacked the drama of fighter-pilot dogfights or the epic quality of bomber formations. They simply went to work, jumped from aircraft under fire, accomplished their missions, and moved to the next operation. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.